The wind howled across the North Atlantic on January 17, 1940. The North American NA-73X, prototype of what would one day be called the P-51 Mustang, surged through the storm like a blade through silk. Vance Breeze, test pilot, pushed the throttle forward with the calm precision of a man who knew the machine was still just a dream. Below, the gray sea churned. Above, the clouds pressed down like the weight of empires. The prototype had taken off only 5 months earlier, in the crisp autumn of 1939. But its wings still painted with experimental stripes cut through the gale at 320 miles an hour. No one yet knew that this single-engine fighter, born in a California hangar on January 17, 1940, would one day outrun the very aircraft that the Luftwaffe loved most, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. January 17, 1940, was not a date etched in headlines. It was a quiet Tuesday in Los Angeles, when James H. Dutch Kindleberger's North American Aviation Company received a cable from the British Purchasing Commission. The commission wanted a modern fighter to replace the outdated Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks flooding into Britain. Kindleberger did not reply with a license. He replied with an audacious proposal: "We can design and build a better one." The British Air Ministry accepted. Within weeks, a contract for 320 aircraft was signed. The Design Bureau, led by Edgar Schmude and Ray Rice, worked through the long winter nights. On September 9, 1940, the NA-73X rolled out on wooden wheels, its first public appearance without an engine. On October 26, Vance Breeze lifted it into the air for the first time. By January 17, 1940, the prototype was in its final flight test phase, climbing, diving, and probing the limits of the new laminar-flow wing that would become its most famous signature. That wing-smooth aluminum skin stretching unbroken from root to tip promised something revolutionary. Low drag, high speed, the ability to carry a huge fuel load without the wingtips drooping. The Allison V1710 engine, a powerful 1,200 horsepower V12, hummed beneath the cowling. But the British Commission had another vision. They wanted a fighter that could fly over Germany and return. The Allison was fine for low-level work, but they needed a more powerful, higher-altitude engine. Rolls-Royce offered the Merlin liquid-cooled, inline, 1,000 horsepower at first, destined to become the most famous engine in aviation history. The decision was made in the spring of 1940. The Mustang would be redesigned with the Merlin, a razor-thin radiator to keep the engine cool at high altitudes, and a longer fuselage. The airframe that left the factory in January 1940 was the raw seed. The British version that reached combat in 1942 was the mature fruit. But the DNA was fixed on that winter morning when the NA-73X first touched down after a hard flight, its wings flexing with the stress of constant testing. The historical records are clear. On January 17, 1940, the prototype achieved a maximum speed of 375 miles per hour at 10,000 feet, impressive for its day. But the real test would come when the Merlin was installed. The laminar-flow wing, a revolutionary invention by NACA, reduced drag by nearly 40% compared with earlier designs. This was not theory, it was data from wind tunnel tests conducted in Langley, Virginia. The wing would let the Mustang carry 400 gallons of fuel, more than twice the capacity of a Bf 109, without sacrificing speed or climb. Why did this moment matter? Because the entire world was on the brink of war. Germany had already invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. Britain was under nightly threat from the Luftwaffe. The Royal Air Force needed a fighter that could escort bombers deep into the Reich and still return home. The P-51's long-range capability was exactly what the Allies had been praying for. Yet in January 1940, who could have imagined that a California prototype would one day be called the Cadillac of the skies? The German pilots, who would later laugh at the American fighter, had no idea that this plane existed. They were busy preparing for the Battle of Britain on the other side of the Atlantic. The Mustang was still a secret, but the seeds were planted. On that January day, the contrast between expectation and reality would define the war. The German fighter pilot of 1940, whether flying a Bf-109 or the newer Bf-110 heavy fighter, believed he had the sky. The Bf-109, with its elegant inverted V engine, thin wings, and 20mm cannons, had already proven itself in Spain and France. It could turn inside the Spitfire and climb like a rocket. The Luftwaffe's doctrine was simple: mass, altitude, and firepower. Hit the bomber streams before they reached Berlin, and victory was inevitable. The Mustang pilot, by contrast, was told to expect the worst. The Allison engine was good for low altitudes, but would run out of breath above 15,000 feet. The British had warned that the American fighter was too slow, too underpowered at high altitude, too dependent on the radiator that cooled the engine. In the pre-war war games, the P-51 was dismissed as a mud mover. It would never outrun the Messerschmitt. It would never escort bombers to Berlin and back. It was a luxury fighter fast on the deck, useless in the thin air of the Reich. That expectation would be shattered on March 4, 1944, but the transformation had already begun in the shadows of 1940. The symbol that would forever represent American abundance and democratic industrial might was not the Mustang itself, but the gasoline that fueled it, 100-octane aviation fuel. The kind of fuel that America could produce in mountains of barrels, while Germany's synthetic fuel program struggled to keep up. The Mustang ran on it, the Bf-109 on 95-octane. The difference was not just technical, it was ideological. In January 1940, that fuel was still being refined in secret California plants. The synthetic rubber and high-octane gasoline plants that would one day supply the entire 8th Air Force were barely on the drawing boards, yet the promise was there. America could outproduce the Axis not just in numbers, but in the very fuel that powered its machines. The early Mustang, the NA-73X, never saw combat. It was used for testing until the Merlin version took its place, but the design choices made on January 17, 1940 long-range, laminar-flow, Merlin engine were the seeds of a revolution. The British Mustang Mk arrived in Britain in 1942. The first USAAF Mustangs reached Europe in December 1943. By the time the Luftwaffe pilots returned from their victories over UNESCO bombers in October 1943, they had no idea what was coming. The emotional contrast was stark. The German pilot climbed into his Bf-109 at dawn, knowing he was better than the enemy. The American Mustang pilot climbed in knowing he was outgunned, outranged, and out-engineered, yet he flew because he believed in something larger than himself. He believed in the freedom to choose his targets, the abundance that let him fly farther, the democracy that let his country build what it needed when it needed it. By the summer of 1944, that belief had become reality. The gap of debt over Berlin had been closed forever. The Luftwaffe, which had once laughed at American bombers, now watched Mustangs circle their capital. All their own fighters were hunted from the skies. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's most brilliant tactician, would later admit in captured reports, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." The transformation was complete. Ideology, that reality. The pilot who once mocked the American fighter, fought for his life against a plane he had once dismissed as mediocre. The P-51 Mustang did not merely outrun the Messerschmitt Bf-109, it hunted the Luftwaffe itself across the skies of Europe, and in doing so, it changed everything. The first combat Mustangs reached the 8th Air Force in December 1943. The pilots who flew them, men like Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group, were not content to stick to the bomber streams. They were told to range ahead, to find the enemy, to hunt. The Germans watched their Bf-109s and FW-190s being shredded from behind at 30,000 feet. The Mustang could climb as fast as the 109 and outrun it in a dive. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns spoke with a voice the Germans had never heard in a single-engine fighter. The symbol of American abundance was everywhere. The long-range fuel tanks dropped like ripe fruit from the wings. The gasoline that powered the Merlin engine produced in America at a rate the Reich could only dream of allowed the Mustang to stay over Berlin for hours. While German pilots returned to bases on fumes, American pilots stayed to strafe airfields to hunt Me-160, the jets, before they took off, to prove that democracy could sustain a war of industrial scale. The transformation of perception was total. The German pilot, who had once laughed at the American joke fighter that watched his aces, including Eric Hartmann, admit in post-war interviews that the Mustang was the plane he most feared. We both dreaded and anticipated meeting the American Mustangs, Hartmann wrote. They were newer and faster, and with a great range. The war was not won by one aircraft, but by the ideology that produced it. American abundance, unlimited fuel, unlimited production, unlimited freedom triumphed over totalitarian scarcity. The Mustang was not just a fighter, it was a statement. It flew because its pilots chose to fly for a country that believed every man had the right to his own sky. As the last P-51 Mustang touched down on an English runway in May 1945, its engines still warm, its pilot looking back at the rising sun over Europe, he knew what the German pilots had only sensed in their final months. Freedom had won the air war. The plane that had once been laughed at was now the reason the Reich fell. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all.